Hey, before your Q3 call, I've got the campaign brief ready, built from last quarter's data and the competitive landscape.
Great. Did you include the differentiation angle the CMO asked for?
Already in there. 3 angles no competitors using right now. Just need your approval.
Approved. Thanks. Oh, agents, where would we be without you?
Somewhere with a lot more tabs open.
Create your first Monday agent in minutes at monday.com.
If your fashion wish list lives rent-free in your brain, you need to be on Poshmark. With Poshmark, you're shopping millions of listings from thousands of closets, each curated by someone with their own style. Vintage finds, designer pieces, and everyday staples all in one place. Search for your favorites or let the discovery come to you. Poshmark makes it easy to find what you actually want to wear at prices that feel like a quiet win. Download the Poshmark app today and use code PODCAST10 when you sign up to get $10 off your first purchase.
Dis Marie Vicarja, it's been far too long since I sat down properly to record one of these, so first of all, apologies for the gap of Roan. The last few weeks have taken me down a bit of a rabbit hole, and in truth, what started out being fairly simple, a bit of local history, turned into something much bigger than I expected, something that I wanted to be just one podcast when I started researching, has spiralled and snowballed. Towards the end of a holiday I took in July, I got a call from a good friend of mine, Dee, who asked me to have a look into this place. And this place that I'm going to talk about today on the podcast and future podcasts is hidden in Cork. It's hidden in plain sight. And it's a building that thousands of people pass without a second glance. But this place, it turns out, is connected with the famine, with Fenian prisoners, with 1916, with hunger strikers, court-martial, the War of Independence, executions, and the Civil War. 14 men were executed there. One of the men shot there was executed for his part in the events of 1916. A Lord Mayor of Cork began his hunger strike within its walls. Men were sentenced to death, waiting there for execution. Others came within hours, and some cases perhaps less of meeting the same fate. And yet for all of that history, most people in Cork have never heard of the place. And that's what I want to explore over the next few episodes. I've been calling it Cork's Kilmainham. Now I should probably explain what I mean by that. Kilmainham Jail is one of Dublin and Ireland's most important buildings. It's inseparable from the story of modern Irish history. Leaders of the 1916 Rising were imprisoned and executed there. Political prisoners passed through its cells. It became a place associated with rebellion, sacrifice, and the struggle for independence. And today, Kilmainham is preserved. Not just preserved, but it displays all of its story to the world because people travel from all over the world to walk through it. The cells, corridors, execution yards are not simply old bricks and stone. They allow us to stand in a physical space where the history happened. Built heritage does have something that books cannot quite do. You can read that somebody was imprisoned. You can read that somebody spent a final night in a cell, and you can read about a date of execution. But there's something entirely different about standing in the room, touching the wall, looking through the same doorway or walking across the same yard. A building can collapse time. Suddenly history stops being a collective or a collection of names and dates and becomes something human. You realise how small the cell was, how close the execution place was, how ordinary the surroundings might have looked on the morning when something extraordinary happened there. And sometimes the building itself is the last witness left. That, Macarja, is why built heritage matters. Not because every old building should be frozen in time, and not because, age alone automatically makes something important, but because once a place where major events happened is gone, that physical connection can never really be recreated. A plaque can tell you what stood where. A photograph can show you what it looked like, but neither is the same as a place itself. And that brings us, Corja, to my own city of Cork, Kirkig. Because Cork had a prison with its own extraordinary connection to the revolutionary period. A military prison, a place of court-martials, and a place of executions. A place through which some of the most important figures in Cork's revolutionary history passed. But unlike Kilmainham, its story has largely disappeared from public memory. In fact, when I first started looking into it, I had no idea quite how deep that story went. I thought I was researching one period and probably one incident, and instead I found myself going backwards, past the war during the revolutionary period, past 1916, past the Fenians, and all the way back to the 1840s, to the years of Ungurtamur. That's where the story of Cork's Kilmainham really begins. Corja, you're listening to Undercover Irish. It's Misha Olin, I'm your host, and in this podcast we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. So Corja, it's good to be back. Eraigling Lekela. Now, Corja, to understand why this prison was built, we have to understand the Cork, Caherkirky, in which it appeared. You know, this tells us a social story or a social history in and of itself. And that means going back to the 1840s. This was not a small military outpost on the edge of the British Empire. Ireland was heavily occupied and heavily garrisoned, and Cork was one of the great centres of that occupation. Then it was called Victoria Barracks, and it dominated the northern side of the city with thousands of soldiers. You know, they passed through Cork and they would have stopped here. There were barracks, depots, military hospitals, stores, and all of the infrastructure needed to support an occupation. And in the middle of that military world, a new prison was built. Not a civilian prison, but a military prison. This was a place designed to punish and control soldiers within the British Army who stepped out of line. But it's the timing of this build that strikes me. This prison was built in the very years when Ireland was descending into catastrophe. By the middle of the 1840s, the potato crop had failed, hunger was spreading, Ungurta Moor had begun. Evictions increased, food riots broke out, and people watched grain and livestock leave districts where families themselves were starving. And the British military was deeply involved in maintaining economic order. To give some sense of the scale of that presence, in about 1831 there were about 16,000 British troops stationed in Ireland. By 1844 that figure had risen to more than 21,000, and by March 1848, you know, the worst year of Ungurta Moor, famine raging and fears of political unrest growing, that number was close to 30,000. So we're talking about an almost doubling of the number of British troops on the island over the course of about 16 or 17 years. Now, these soldiers were not simply sitting behind barrack walls. They guarded prisons and courthouses. They escorted police and bailiffs. They were deployed during food riots, and they protected grain stores. They accompanied food and livestock through areas where people were hungry and dying of hunger. And they were used to enforce the authority of the state at a time of extraordinary social collapse. That's the world in which the Cork Military District Prison, as it was first known, was created. So the building itself tells us something about the social history of the time. But it also tells us something about the thinking of the period, both in terms of where Britain actually invested during a time of hunger and also in terms of its model of imprisonment. It was built on the new Victorian model of imprisonment that had become fashionable in Britain at the time. And the important name here is a guy called Colonel Joshua Jebb. Jebb was one of the most influential prison designers and reformers of the 19th century, and he was closely associated with Pentonville Prison in London. Pentonville was supposed to represent a new, modern, and almost scientific approach to punishment. Prisoners were separated and isolated, movement was controlled, and observation was built into the very architecture. The layout was designed so that the authority could see, regulate, and isolate. And Cork's military prison followed the same general philosophy. This is important because the building was not simply somewhere that happened to contain prisoners. The building itself was part of the punishment. The corridors, the cells, the sight lines, and controlled movement were all designed around what they regarded as discipline. And initially, the people being disciplined here were British soldiers. That might seem like an important distinction from the later story of Irish Republican prisoners, but in fact, it leads us directly towards it. Because one of the problems facing the British Army in 19th century Ireland was that a very large number of men wearing British uniforms were themselves Irish. They came from Irish towns and villages. They were overwhelmingly from working class backgrounds, and many were Catholic. And in a century of enormous political change, some of the soldiers began to ask uncomfortable questions about the country in which they were serving. So long before this prison ever held the men we associate with 1916 or the revolutionary period, it was already sitting at the centre of a much older tension, an army of occupation containing within its own ranks thousands of Irishmen. And occasionally these tensions erupted in unexpected ways. There's one early incident in particular that gives us a glimpse into that world. It involved religion, military discipline, and a Catholic soldier. And it caused enough controversy to briefly shine a public light on what was happening inside the walls of Cork's new military prison. So, Corja, one of the earliest controversies connected with this prison came not from Republican politics, but from religion. Now, to understand why this particular story that I'm going to talk about caused such a stir, we need to look at a little bit of the context in Ireland and elsewhere. For generations, the penal laws had restricted the rights of Catholics in Ireland. Now, this was part of the empire's divide and rule, with political power, landholding, and public office dominated by the Protestant Ascendancy. And some of those restrictions started to be dismantled by the time the early 19th century started to come around. For example, Catholic Emancipation, allowing Catholics to sit in Parliament in 1829, was one of the big moments of that century. But of course, this didn't take away a lot of the discrimination that existed within society in Ireland and elsewhere. And in researching this prison, an amazing story pops up. Essentially, the prisoners within the Cork District Military Prison, as it was still known at that point, they didn't have access to Catholic Mass on a Sunday, and applications were made. And in March of 1858, the newspapers report a controversy around this provision. Essentially, it was agreed that they would be allowed a Catholic chaplain within the prison. Now again, looking through it, the lens of today, we may not think that this is such a big deal. However, at the time, it caused outrage. There were letters to editors and newspapers in Britain up and down that country. In particular, the decision provoked opposition from the Scottish Reformation Society. They wrote to the Secretary at War and condemned the arrangement as official encouragement of, quote, popery. So this dispute reflects the wider social history of the period when sectarianism remained a powerful and divisive force. even the provision of Sunday worship could become politically charged. And the incident offers us a glimpse of daily life within the prison, where military authority extended beyond just, confinement and discipline, but to the regulation of religious practice. So when we think about the stories and the social history that a bricks and mortar site can tell us about the past, this is just one such example. So long before the revolutionary prisoners we will meet both in this episode and later in the series, the building was already a place where questions of religion, authority, and identity were being contested. And within a few years, those questions of loyalty would move from the chapel to something far more serious. Because Accordia, by the 1860s, a revolutionary movement was spreading throughout Ireland, the Fenians. And the Fenians understood that if you wanted to challenge British power in Ireland, one of the most valuable places to recruit men was from within the British Army itself. They wanted trained soldiers, men who understood weapons, men who knew military discipline, men who knew, crucially, the workings of barracks, depots and garrisons. And Cork, Caherkirky, with its enormous military presence, was an obvious place to look. So from here the story changes. The prisoners passing through the cells are no longer simply men guilty of ordinary quote-unquote military offences. Some are now accused of conspiracy, of treason, of Fenianism. And from this military prison, the story will eventually stretch to London and to Western Australia, and one of the most extraordinary prison escapes in world history.
Cozy season is ahead, and you'll be spending way more time inside. Is your home ready? Don't worry. With Wayfair, you can upgrade your space without breaking the bank. Score up to 70% off during their Labor Day clearance on furniture, area rugs, mattresses, and more. Plus, surprise flash deals you can't miss. Whether it's one room or the whole house, Wayfair has pieces for every style and budget.
Shop Wayfair's Labor Day clearance now through September 7th at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Looking for great deals on the products you already love? The latest Waves of Abundance sale is happening now at Azure Standard. Discover special savings on organic groceries, pantry favorites, household essentials, gardening products, wellness items, and more. New offers are featured across the site, making it a great time to stock up and save. Azure Standard is the place to go for everything you need, all in one place. Shop the latest Waves of Abundance sale today at azurestandard.com. That's AZURE standard.com.
Accordia, by the middle of the 1860s, the threat facing the British authorities was no longer simply unrest outside the barrack gates. John Devoy had secretly oated thousands of Fenians within the British Army itself. So I went in search to see if there was any link with this particular military detention barracks. And sure enough, I saw that there were Fenians imprisoned at this site. A quote from the newspapers says, "It is rumoured that Drum Major Butler, 2nd Queen's, and Sergeant Farrell, 99th Regiment, who it will be remembered were placed in arrest for complicity in the Fenian movement, are to be tried by a general court-martial. They are at present confined in Cork District Military Prison." And this dates back to 1865, proving that at least 2 Fenians were imprisoned at this site. But it's the 3rd Fenian that I came across in researching this episode. It's a story that will really blow your mind. This remarkable example was a man called Thomas Darragh. Now, Darragh is useful to us because he completely complicates the image we might have of a Fenian revolutionary. Firstly, he was a Protestant, and he had been a member of the Orange Order, believe it or not. He was not some young, disaffected young recruit who had barely spent time in a uniform. He was experienced and highly decorated as a British soldier. He had served what the language of the time described as, quote, Queen and country abroad, including military service in China and South Africa. He had been decorated for gallantry and had risen through the ranks to become a sergeant major. In 1864, his own commanding officer apparently thought highly enough of him to recommend that he be placed on the waiting list for an official officer's commission. For a man who had risen from the ranks, that was no small achievement. Dara had every reason, on the surface at least, to remain loyal to the system which had built his career. But by then something had changed. The previous year, 1863, Dara had committed himself to the Fenian cause secretly. And his story is a reminder of something important about Fenianism that can sometimes be lost when we look back at it through the later divisions of Irish politics. This was not conceived as a Catholic-only movement. The Fenians consciously reached back towards the Republican tradition of the United Irishmen of 1798. Catholics could belong, Protestants could belong. For Dara and other Protestant Fenians, republicanism offered an Ireland in which religious identity would not be determined by political belonging. By his own reckoning, the British uniform he wore no longer represented his ultimate loyalty. He had come to believe that Irish soldiers were being used as cannon fodder in Britain's wars, and that Ireland should instead become a republic of its own. And Dara did not keep those beliefs to himself. In 1865, while stationed at the prestigious School of Musketry at Fleetwood in England, he became what the Fenians called a, quote, B, effectively an organiser within the British Army, and he began recruiting. Not one man, not two men. According to the later account of his story, Dara succeeded in bringing several hundred soldiers into the Fenian organisation. Now think about what that meant from the point of view of the British authorities. These were trained soldiers. These were men who could shoot. They understood drills, weapons and military organisation. The men had access to barracks, and crucially men who might be expected to obey orders if a rebellion broke out. The fear was not simply that Britain might have to confront a Fenian army. It was that some of the men standing in British uniform might turn their weapons the other way. By the autumn of 1865, the authorities were moving against the organisation. In September, guards entered the barracks at Fleetwood. Thomas Dara was arrested. Chains were placed around his wrists and ankles, and instead of being dealt with locally, he was put aboard a military transport and sent across the Irish Sea. Yes, to Cork. He was brought to the Second Queen's Barracks, part of the enormous military complex overlooking the city, and there he faced a drumhead court-martial. And the sentence Corja was extraordinary. Thomas Dara was sentenced to death, to be hanged. That gives us one of the earliest direct links between the Fenian revolutionary movement and the military prison whose story we're now following. Long before the executions of the revolutionary period, long before 1916, there had already been a man connected with Fenianism, rebellion, sitting under sentence of death within the Cork Military District Prison. But Dara's sentence would be commuted. His journey, however, was far from over, because the British authorities had another solution for men like him. If they were considered too dangerous to remain in Ireland or in Britain, they could be removed from both. Thousands of miles removed. Transportation. And that is how our story, which begins in the military prison overlooking Cork City, is about to cross the world, all the way to Fremantle, to Western Australia, and eventually to a ship called the Catalpa. So for Thomas Dara, the death sentence did not mean execution, but mercy meant exile. And exile in the 19th century meant transportation literally to the other side of the world. For Irish political prisoners, transportation was designed to do more than punish the individual. It meant that the dangerous organisers, as they would see it from the British point of view, were removed from Ireland, and it broke up networks. It placed thousands of miles of ocean between a prisoner and the political movement which he belonged to. And in the case of these Fenians, the destination was Western Australia, Fremantle Prison. By the 1860s, Western Australia was one of the last parts of the British Empire still receiving transported convicts. And among the prisoners sent there were Irish Fenians, including men who had served within the British Army. So the men transported from the British military system carried a particular stigma. And for Dara, the journey from Cork to imprisonment and then onwards to the penal system was part of a much larger imperial machinery. This is where geography of the story becomes extraordinary. So we begin in Cork, at the Cork Military District Prison. We move across the Irish Sea into the British military network. And suddenly we're travelling thousands of miles by ship out through the Atlantic and around the world to Western Australia. For the prisoners themselves, transportation must have felt almost final. There were no cheap passages home. They had been removed to the edge of an empire. And yet, instead of ending the Fenian story, transportation actually internationalised it. Because Irish republicanism was no longer confined to Ireland. There were large and politically active Irish communities in Britain, Australia, and also the United States of America. And the movement had money, it had organisers, and it had veterans of American wars. And it had people who were not prepared to accept that the ocean made the prisoners unreachable. The men in Fremantle had supporters thousands of miles away who were thinking about them, writing to them, planning, waiting, and eventually a plan was being formed that sounded almost impossible. To sail from America to Western Australia, to reach the prisoners without alerting the authorities, and to get them out of Fremantle, to bring them to the coast, and then get them aboard an American ship before the British could stop them. It sounds like the plot of a novel or a movie, but it happened, and the ship at the centre of the plan was called the Catalpa. And the plan itself was audacious from the start. It relied on the money raised in the United States, it relied on secrecy, on deception, and on the simple fact that the British authorities could not imagine that anybody would attempt something so elaborate. The Catalpa ship that was chosen was an American whaler. On paper, she was going to sea to hunt whales. In reality, she had another purpose. She was to sail halfway around the world, reach Western Australia, lie offshore without attracting suspicion, and provide the escape route for a group of Fenian prisoners held around Fremantle. The operation took months. Contacts had to be made on the ground, movements had to be watched, prison routines had to be understood, transport had to be arranged, and above all, the whole thing had to remain secret. Because if the authorities discovered the plan too early, it was over. Eventually, in April 1876, the moment came. 6 Fenian prisoners made their escape. They were moved away from Fremantle and towards the coast, where a small boat was waiting to take them out to the Catalpa. But the alarm was raised. British authorities began searching for them. Police and military forces were mobilised, and the escape actually turned into a race. The men still had to reach the ship. The ship still had to remain available. And once the authorities realised what was happening, they were determined not to let the prisoners simply sail away. This part of the story almost feels like it was written deliberately or especially for a cinema audience. The escape boat made its way towards the Catalpa. A British vessel pursued. The authorities demanded that the men be surrendered. But here's the catch. The Catalpa was an American ship, and once she was in international waters, that took precedence. The American flag was raised. The message was simple. These men are now aboard an American vessel, and any attempt to board or fire upon her risked becoming something far larger than just the escape of 6 prisoners. And so the British backed off, and the Catalpa sailed on the 6 Fenians were free, and it was a spectacular propaganda victory. Men who the British Army had transported out to one of the most distant corners of the world had been taken out from under its nose by an operation organised across continents. And this is where I think the story becomes particularly striking when we bring it back to Cork. Because one of the threads leading into the Catalpa story begins with a British soldier who had risen through the ranks, had served the Empire abroad, had been decorated for gallantry, and then secretly joined the Fenian movement. Thomas Darragh, the man arrested in England, sent to Cork, tried by court-martial and sentenced to death. And then drawn into this extraordinary, wider story of transportation, imprisonment, and escape. So when we look at the history of this military prison in Cork, we're not looking at a building whose history begins in 1916, which is where I started looking at the story. By then, it already had decades of political and social history behind it. It had been built in the shadow of An Gorta Mór. It had stood at the centre of arguments about religion and military discipline. It had held men accused of Fenian conspiracy. And through those prisoners, the story reached all the way to Western Australia, the Catalpa, and finally New York, where the Catalpa sailed into freedom. This is only the first layer of the story Accorda. And in the next episode we move to a very different Ireland. The empire is still there, the prison is still there, but now the revolutionary struggle is no longer being organised quietly inside British regiments. By 1916, the rebellion has come out into the open. And one man will be brought into this prison, taken into its yard, and executed. His body will then be hidden. And for almost a century, his grave will remain there. For much of it, secret. And that's where I'm going to leave the story for this episode. But before I finish Accorda, there's one reason I wanted to make this series now. This is not just history for history's sake. The building I've been talking about is still standing, for now at least. At present, the plan for this building is to demolish it. And that's why these podcasts are part of something bigger for me. They're part of an appeal to save it. Because once a building like this is gone, it's gone. You can preserve the photographs, you can preserve the documents, and you can put up a plaque. But you can't recreate the place itself. And in this case, we're talking about a building connected to An Gorta Mór, to the Fenians, to 1916, to hunger strikes, to court-martials, to executions, to the revolutionary period. A building where 14 men were executed. A building with a direct connection to 1916. A building that in any other country, I believe, it would be recognised as a major historical site. So over the next few episodes, I want to tell you the story as fully as I can. What myself and Dee have uncovered in just a month and a half of research. I believe this is only a drop in the ocean and there's so much more to be found out about this building. Because I think the first step in saving a place is making sure people understand what it is and what we stand to lose. If this series does anything, I hope it helps bring the story into public view. Because Accorda, this is Cork's Kilmainham. And for me, hopefully the story is only beginning. Accorda Shinawil, Goramila Mahagut Osuktvelum on this episode. Thank you so much. I'd always ask for people to share these podcasts and leave a review and to do all of those things to help promote the podcast if you've enjoyed it. But particularly when there's something like this at stake, Accorda, I really do urge you to share it and to share its visibility. Follow me on Instagram so that you can follow the campaign, which is only beginning, as I say. And until the next episode of Accorda, Berigi Bua agus Slán go fóill.
Do Do you hear that? That sound, right? That means that summer's officially here. It means that grown adults just sprint into the street for a frozen dessert shaped like a cartoon. But this summer, Mint Mobile has a better treat. Every plan, including unlimited, is $15 a month. And unlike ice cream, it won't drip down your wrist or look nothing like the picture. Does anyone have any cash? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. New customer offer for initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
It's time for another Waves of Abundance sale at Azure Standard. Shop featured savings across organic groceries, pantry supplies, wellness products, household essentials, gardening supplies, and more. Whether you're stocking up on favorites or discovering something new, there's never been a better time to save. Explore this month's Wave of Abundance offers today at azurestandard.com. That's AZURE standard.com.